Hey, what's going on, guys? Ben Brewster here at Tread Athletics, and today I want to go over some of my least favorite cues for pitchers, so some of the worst pitching cues. Now, let me just start by saying, technically, there's no such thing as a good or bad cue because everyone is going to interpret cues differently. If you tell two different pitchers to bend their back, for example, that might click differently in the head of one guy versus another. That being said, I am going to go through why I'm not a fan of a lot of these different cues and give you guys a specific hard rationale for that and why I have seen them do more harm than good in a lot of cases. So just off the bat, there really is no such thing as a good or bad cue. It's all about specifically, is that cue the best cue that clicks for that athlete at the time. Second, red flag coaches. If you're an athlete watching this, your pitcher, be aware of coaches who give the exact same prescription philosophy to every single player that they coach. So if your coach is telling you the exact same thing as all 12 other pitchers on your team, to me that's a red flag because again, everybody's different, everybody's going to be interpreting things differently, move differently, have different sets of mechanics, etc. Again, it depends on interpretation. So I might say something that clicks with you, but not click with another athlete. And so it's helpful to have different ways of explaining things to different athletes because you never know which cue or which form of explaining mechanics might click with a certain guy. So just keep that in mind, it's very individual. General guidelines for cues before I go and break these down so that you guys kind of understand the framework of where I'm coming from. This is my philosophy. So in general, I'm a fan of cues that are more proximal versus distal. So what does that mean? Proximal means center of the body. Distal means further away. So you can think your hands, your arms, your feet, your legs. That's distal. That's far away from the middle of your body. Proximal would be cues that have to do with your pelvis, your torso, your core, the center of your body and how that moves. So hip rotation, trunk rotation, things like that. So in general, the distal segments of your body, your arms and legs are going to follow what the center of your body is doing. So if we focus on our extremities versus on the center of our body, that can often create weak links or disconnections in the chain. So in general, proximal cues that focus on the center of the body tend to be superior to distal cues. Internal versus external. So different cues have different classifications. Internal cue would be something where it's focusing your attention on something specific that's happening in your body. So for example, if I just told you like we need to think about keeping the elbow angle at exactly 90 degrees, and so now when you go and you try to pitch, all your focus is on the specific body position that you're trying to recreate. And so that takes all your focus away from what you're actually trying to execute, what you're actually trying to do. So maybe an external cue is something outside of your body. It's a task, it's focus your attention externally. Hey, let's blow up the center of the catcher versus, hey, let's focus on exactly where our arm is in space. One of those guys is gonna move robotically more times than not. One of those guys is gonna move athletically and dynamically. So in general, avoiding internal cues tends to be the right move. Research is in favor of external cues. And then encouraging high-level patterns. So do these various cues encourage movements that reflect what pitchers at the highest level of the game do by and large. So there are general principles and commonalities if you watch 95 plus mile an hour guys throwing on TV, right? They have violent, explosive rotation. They have great sequencing. Their hips rotate in front of their torso, rotates before their arm goes, and they have great sequencing. So any cue that robs a pitcher of the ability to elicit these efficient patterns or kills rotation or kills this intensity, aggressiveness that would create high velocity, to me that's a red flag. So we want to identify cues that allow for the type of patterns that you will see on TV that allows for what the highest level throwers in the world do. And then final point before we get into some of these cues is, well, are cues even necessary? And in a lot of cases, what you'll find is that cues are really overused. And the gold standard to me is that if you can find a way as a coach to elicit a pattern or mechanical change without even having to give a verbal cue, without even having to speak, by designing some sort of constraint or drill or movement or environment that encourages the pattern that you're looking for without explicitly telling the athlete to focus on that. So an example, again, we can go back to, hey, keep your arm at 90 degrees. Right now all the athletes' focus is on keeping their arm at 90 degrees when they throw. Or you could say, we're gonna play catch with a football for 5 minutes before we play catch with a baseball. I don't care what you think about, we're just gonna play catch with a football. And you might generate the exact same pattern, but hey, what's the difference? Their focus is now not internal, it's not on exactly what's going on in their mechanics. They're not worrying about their mechanics. You're just giving them a different implement, a different constraint, and their body's figuring it out subconsciously and on its own. So when possible, I actually don't like to use cues if we can address that with some sort of constraint where you take the mind completely out of it and just let them be a free, athletic, dynamic athlete. That's the overall background. Let's get into some common cues and why I'm not a fan of these ones. So the first two cues that I want to kind of debunk or give my take on, one is bend your back, and the other one is get out in front. Now both of these are kind of similar because bend your back is really encouraging that finish to the throw, trying to get over top of the ball, and get out in front is again encouraging the finish of the throw, getting the arm out in front, getting that good extension, get good trunk extension, and trying to get through and on top of the ball. Right? There's good intention behind these cues. My problem with them is twofold. One, this is an issue because it tends to focus all the attention, all the effort on the end of the throw, when really by the time you get to the very finish of the throw, there's very little you can actually do to control what's happening by that point in time. So what I mean by that is extension and the position you get to at ball release is actually a result of what happened earlier on in the throw and the loading and unloading process. By the point that you actually get to landing, the throw has largely already been predetermined what your release point is going to look like. And so if your body is naturally trying to release in a certain posture, and then you artificially at the very end of the throw bend your back to try to get there, you're killing that actual rotational plane from taking the natural path that it would have. So to me, trunk extension, getting out in front, this is something that happens as a natural byproduct of loading and unloading the lower half properly, and you're naturally going to get to that position, versus if you have some sort of disconnect in your mechanics and you try to at the last second artificially get there, that's just adding a kink to the kinetic chain. That's an inefficiency. And so we need to actually figure out, why are you not having good extension? Why are you not able to get on top of the ball at release, versus trying to artificially just maneuver that and manufacture that at the very last second. So it tends to be an issue from a sequencing standpoint and a killing rotation standpoint. One example would be how most tower drills are done, where a bucket is placed at the bottom of the mound, someone jumps off the mound and tries to reach and hit the bucket. Well, if all that mattered was getting maximum extension, that might be a good drill, but the problem is you just killed rotation and you artificially change the efficiency of the throw and of the sequencing just to hit this extension number, just to look a certain way in a still picture or still photo, like your pitching coach wanted you to look. So to me, I'm not a fan of either of those. It doesn't mean extension isn't a factor. It just means that's more of an effect that happens down the chain, and we need to understand what's happening earlier in the throw that can influence that, versus trying to address it by the time that throw is already almost finished. The next cue that I don't like is push off the rubber. Now, granted, this does mean different things to different pitchers. There are going to be some big leaguers who have always heard push off the rubber and they think that that's what they're doing. But in general, my experience when you give a pitcher this cue is they tend to get very quad dominant. They tend to jump and extend early off the rubber. And so it becomes this violent knee extension and hip extension movement. The problem with that is, again, we go back to this, you're killing rotation, you're killing sequencing. When you jump and extend and you get in this position where your hip is fully extended, you no longer have as much room in the actual hip socket to rotate from. If you try to rotate from this position, it's really hard to maneuver your hips from there. But if you don't get fully extended, now you actually have room within your pelvis, within your hip joint, to create good rotation and actually get all that energy up the chain into the ball. So I'm not a fan of pushing off the rubber because it leads to this quad dominant jumping, pushing, extending pattern versus what the vast majority of high level throwers do, which is rotate into ball release. So I've addressed this in more detail in my most recent Q&A video. You can check the description, link in the description to watch that as well. The next cue that I'm not a fan of is point the ball towards second base. So I can think back to Little League. I was told this, and every coach has you go through this very robotic arm spiral, finish, pause, look at your hand, and then throw, and it's just a very brutal pattern that, again, kills sequencing, kills rotation, and we already talked about that is now an internal focus. So now the pitcher is going through their delivery, and they're trying to hit a checkpoint, and their focus is on that. It's not on executing the pitch, it's not on blowing out the catcher, being aggressive, and getting the hitter out. It's on what their hand's doing, where their fingers are. So I'm not a fan of it for that reason. I'm also not a fan of it from a biomechanical standpoint, because when you do that, now you start to introduce tension in the pronator flexor. So versus having a natural loose wrist where you allow that arm to naturally spiral, think just throwing a football, right? There's not like this tension in the forearm where you're trying to pronate and you're trying to hit a certain position. The wrist is loose, relaxed, and you're just letting everything flow. So I'm not a huge fan of it from a biomechanical standpoint, not a huge fan of it from shifting that focus to an internal focus. So I think we can do better than that. Neutral, relaxed wrist tends to be a better way to coach and think about wrist position through an arm spiral. The next one is finish in a good fielding position. I'm sure I was told this 100 times in Little League. The problem with this, and again, it comes from well-intentioned coaches who simply don't understand and don't have this long-term perspective of like, we're trying to develop high-level mechanics long-term if this player wants to play in college, maybe at professional level, and ultimately throw hard enough to do so. You're killing rotation. Again, we go back to this, you're killing rotation if the focus from the very start of the throw is on getting in that finished position versus actually executing the pitch. So again, you take their focus away from attacking the hitter, attacking the catcher, and trying to finish in this picture perfect position. You're killing hip rotation, you're killing trunk rotation, and ultimately that's not going to support elite velocities in general. So not to mention when you actually go and you look at Gold Glove pitchers, like Bob Gibson is a great example. Did he finish in a perfect fielding position? No, most hard throwers don't, because they're rotating so violently that their momentum and their delivery does take them off towards their glove side as they follow through. But they're good enough athletes that they can still bounce back, react, and field their position. So again, Bob Gibson, Gold Glove pitcher, and there's a string of guys like that who don't finish in this picture perfect fielding position. I think that's been pretty thoroughly debunked at this point, so I'm not gonna harp on it too much more. The next cue is throw your tricep. So referring to this idea of you need to throw the tricep at the target, almost like a dart throw, and how that this should somehow be the pattern that we're trying to replicate when it comes to a high-level arm path. The issue with that is that that's not what hard throwers do. That's just simply not what big leaguers who throw hard with efficient arm paths do. Go watch Jacob deGrom, Blake Snell, you can pick anybody. The way that their arm actually unfolds and spirals is that the arm actually swings out and around along a spiral path, a helical path, in line with wherever their trunk posture is. So if it's an over-the-top guy, think Tim Lincecum, it's more of an upright posture, and the arm spirals out into that path. If it's more of a sidearm guy, the arm spirals out in plane with where their trunk rotation is. But it's not a shooting the elbow forward, throwing the tricep, and dart throwing with your tricep. It's more of a spiraling, relaxed, whip-like mechanism. So I've done a video on that. It's called the second arm spiral. Go ahead, watch that if you want more information. But again, for me, that just isn't very representative of how hard throwers actually move and how they actually throw. Two more cues that I don't like, which are kind of linked, are pull the glove arm. So yank the glove arm to begin trunk rotation, and chest to glove. So this idea of bringing your chest to the glove and stabilizing the glove out front. Now, both of these are essentially saying opposite things as far as what should I do with my glove arm, but I actually don't like either of them for basically the same reason, which again goes back to it's more of a distal cue. We're focusing on the glove arm, we're not focusing on the center of rotation. My experience in my own career in coaching pitchers is that, again, the glove arm, the lead leg, these distal segments will typically follow what the center of the body is doing. So our goal should be to allow the glove arm to freely sink in to where the torso is, to the plane of the torso. So anything that gets the glove arm way out of that plane, either way back here, or we completely cut off our rotation by trying to artificially stabilize our glove arm here. To me, that's taking focus away from where it should be. Specifically with the chest to the glove cue, I know this has been kind of popular for 2 decades now. Anytime I've seen pitchers that were coached to throw that way, almost entirely they throw slow. Almost entirely, when you get them away from that and you encourage violent rotation with good smooth sequencing, the velocity will shoot up. And the reason being is almost all of them have these very controlled deliveries where they finish in a good fielding position and all their focus is on what this glove arm is doing versus on just absolutely throwing the crap out of the ball, finishing their hip rotation, finishing their trunk rotation, and blowing up the target again with that external focus. With pulling the glove arm, what we typically see is when a guy is cued this giant pull, it ends up just pulling them open early versus trying to keep the glove arm in the plane of the shoulders and letting it basically screw everything down in the plane of the shoulders. So I like to think of the glove arm as screwing you down into landing and staying in the plane of the shoulders the entire time. Sure, there's gonna be some scap retraction, but consciously yanking the glove arm and this really hard yank tends to pull guys open early and ruin the flow, ruin the sequencing. So for that reason, I don't like either of those two cues. So the next two that I don't like are come to a balance point or get your balance, and tall and fall. So let me explain. When you look at what the hardest throwers do and how they move, they typically have very quick tempos. They're quick down the mound. And one of the reasons for that is they're not rushing through their delivery. They're not just trying to get down the mound as fast as they possibly can in that sense. They have a good initial weight shift where they're actually not coming to an initial balance point. If you go and watch Nolan Ryan and watch how he throws, he's under control. He can control his body through that motion, but he's moving forward into his leg lift. He's starting to get moving down the mound early because of that, and this is what we call the drift. His center of mass is moving away from the rubber and from his back leg early, and it forces the rest of the throw to be quick and be up tempo. So coming to a balance point, you're encouraging these very slow, robotic, up, down, out deliveries, where now the arm has to take over and do a lot of the work to actually compensate for the lower half not getting going early. So I'm not a huge fan of different balance point work in general. And then from a tall and fall standpoint, again, to me, this encourages a pitcher to really not use their lower half whatsoever. So just coming up here, hitting your balance, falling, you're essentially training a pitcher to have a dead back leg that isn't actually supplying any power, any rotation, any direction to the throw. So the way that I like to think of it when someone says drop and drive or tall and fall, the way that I like to explain it to guys is the first move, the first part of the lower half is the drift. That's when everything gets going forward. Your weight starts to subtly shift away from the rubber. The second part is the drop or the hinge. So that you go from the drift, you drop into your lower half, and you can also consider this the hinge. You drop into it and you start riding that backside towards the target with tension in your back hip. And then the third part is rotate. So drift, drop or hinge, and then rotate just before landing. The hips pop open into landing, and that's what spirals everything up the chain. So drift, drop, rotate versus tall and fall, dead back leg, or drop and drive, push off the back leg, sink your weight down. Neither of those are efficient lower half mechanics. It's really a better descriptor when you add in the drift, drop and hinge and rotate of what the hardest, most efficient throwers actually do. So the next one I want to talk about is extending the front knee. So as coaches begin to learn more about how the lead leg block works, realizing, hey, you get to landing, ideally you want this front leg to stabilize, and as you rotate, that lead leg begins to extend, it braces, and everything slingshots through from your upper half, right? The problem is, once you hear that, some coaches will go and say, hey, we need to actively think about pushing our lead leg. So they'll have a guy, maybe lands here, kind of soft front leg, notice that that's a problem, but then the focus becomes, let's extend and consciously push ourselves into extension, trying to mimic what they see these hard throwers doing on TV. The issue is that that's not the actual reason that a hard thrower's lead leg extends. It extends because they're rotating effectively. So I'll give you just a quick demo here of what I'm talking about, and then you can watch a video I'm going to link down below on the lead leg block if you want more information. If I just stand here in a stride and I turn my pelvis all the way closed and then all the way open, watch what my lead leg does in response to my hips rotating. As my hips rotate, this lead leg is pulled into extension. You see it in hitters when they rotate, you see it in pitchers as they rotate. I'm not pushing my lead leg into extension. I'm rotating my pelvis through, and this side of my pelvis, as it rotates through, it actually pulls this leg into extension. So the block is really getting the foot down and rotating effectively, and that's what pulls the lead leg into extension. So we can do drills that encourage, again, rotation. That's going to help train and improve and groove a good lead leg block, again, without having to focus on the distal side, the end of the throw, focusing on the center and rotation. So another cue I don't like is anything that has to do with exactly how that front foot should land. So maybe it would be land on the heel, or maybe it's land on the toe, or maybe it's land on your entire foot, or maybe it's stomp on the ground, or maybe it's land with that front foot directly facing towards the target, or maybe it's land with that front foot facing closed. The issue with a lot of these cues, and I've addressed this further in one of my more recent Q&As, which I'll again link down below, is that there's a lot of different variables at play here. Whether you land on the heel, whether you land on the toe, is going to be dictated in large part based on where your upper half is going into landing. If your upper half is way back here, you're more likely to be a heel lander. If your upper half is way out here, you're gonna be a toe lander. So it's not as simple as just telling them to focus on the very end of the throw. It again comes back to what's happening center of the body and up top and earlier in the throw. When it comes to whether you should land closed, straight onto the target, again, there's more at play here. Pitchers with really, really good hip rotation, so good hip internal rotation, they can turn their foot in really far. They'll actually be able to block better, produce more velocity. This applies to myself if they land with that front foot a little bit closed. They actually are able to create more stiffness and more of a stable block if they land a little bit closed. Other pitchers, based on their hip structure, the structure of their knee joint, their tibia, they'll produce more power if they land straight on. So we don't want to pin a pitcher into a specific box and say you have to throw this way unless we kind of have that context and again, recognize that there's different ways to achieve the same goal. If you look at the big leagues, you're going to see a ton of different ways that lead foot lands. And as long as they're able to transfer the energy effectively up into their upper half, it can definitely work. So just be careful forcing guys into the same box with lead foot cues. So I'm also really not a fan of this other cue, which is anything that has to do with forcing scap retraction. So maybe it's talking about yank the elbow behind your body. Maybe it's just doing a scap retraction drill where the focus, maybe it's pulling the bow and arrow. Anything that's trying to cue you to force more scap retraction by pulling horizontally behind your body, I'm really not a fan of that. I think that's ruining a lot of arm actions out there. Simply because, again, pitching coaches know enough to be dangerous in some cases. They know that, hey, scap retraction can be a good indicator. We want to ideally be able to get the scaps into a retracted position, create that stretch through the chest, right? That's good. The problem is how you get there matters. It's not about just hitting a static position for video. It's how do you actually flow through that position and stitch that loop of energy together to get that ball to the target as efficiently as possible. When you yank back horizontally, you lose that ability to spiral the arm and connect that energy in one fluid loop. So rather than yanking the arm back and then having it immediately shoot forward, this is what I tried for years, by the way, because I thought that it was about breaking with the elbows aggressively. And what would happen is I would break with the elbows, I'd land with my arm late, and I'd begin to rotate, and my arm wouldn't get up until I was completely open to the target. Once I started to understand, it's not about forcing scap retraction, it's about letting the arm pendulum and spiral, and it's naturally gonna take your arm back behind the body into this position. So again, watch Jacob deGrom, watch Blake Snell, and watch how they still pass through these positions, but they're not trying to force or cheat just to get to a position, just so a motion capture number looks better on an immediate report. It's not about that, it's about the end result, and it's about how fluidly you can move through these positions. So for that reason, I'm not a huge fan of forcing scap retraction and any cue that has to do with that. So I saved the best, and by best I mean worst, for last, and that one is just throw strikes. This always drives me crazy when coaches tell a pitcher who's struggling to throw strikes, just throw strikes, as though that's somehow going to magically fix the problem. The issue with this is that it shifts the focus to, in a lot of cases, not every case, but it shifts the focus to being way more concerned about the outcome, way more concerned with exactly where they put the ball. It leads to nibbling, it leads to less aggressive mentality on the mound. It leads to a pitcher doubting himself, and it simply doesn't work in most cases. So for me, I try to shift the focus. If a pitcher is struggling with command, it's like, A, we need to figure out, is there anything mechanically going on? Is their direction way off? How can we work to improve that? But B, what's actually going on in between their ears? What's going on from their routine standpoint? What's going on from their mental standpoint, their focus standpoint? What's their actual goal when they're trying to attempt to deliver this pitch? So in general, if we can influence that in a very simple way that gets them into an aggressive mentality where they give themselves more of the actual plate, more of the strike zone to work with, versus trying to nibble, being scared, just throw strikes, not very helpful. So I did a video on one of my favorite cues for this, one of the kind of immediate cues that can really help with command. So go ahead and click that video in the description as well if you're interested in learning more. But again, not a huge fan of just throw strikes. I just think that's not very helpful. You need to understand the underlying reason that they're struggling with their command. Guys, thanks again for watching. What pitching related cues did I miss? What are the worst cues in your opinion? Let me know down below. And then finally, if you aren't already subscribed to this channel, go ahead, hit that button right now, hit the notification bell. And if you don't follow us on Instagram or Twitter, you can search us up at Tread Athletics and at Tread_athletics to interact with us on a daily basis. Finally, if you guys are struggling with anything in your own careers, you can go ahead, email us, contact@treadathletics.com, and we'll help point you in the right direction. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.